very large reptiles already capable of doing damage, maybe even more dangerous than anyone thought. The plot is playing out right now in Florida. ABC's Andrew Dimberg has more.
The camera does not lie. Somewhere over the Florida Everglades, a drone cuts through humid air, its lens aimed straight down at water so black it looks like a mirror turned against the sky. And what it captures, in full daylight, in the 21st century, with every satellite and sensor humanity has ever built, stops the researchers watching the feed completely cold. A Burmese python, longer than a pickup truck, moving through sawgrass like it owns every inch of ground beneath it, not hiding, not fleeing, moving the way something moves when it has no reason to fear anything around it. And the researchers go quiet, not because they have never seen a python before. They go quiet because of what surrounds it. Nothing. No birds lifting off the water, no rabbits breaking through the grass, no deer crossing the tree line in the distance. Just open, breathless silence where an entire living world used to be. That silence is what this footage is actually about. Hi viewers, before we go any further, drop one word in the comments right now. When you look at land that has gone completely silent, does that feel like nature to you? Or does that feel like a warning? The Everglades cover more than 1.5 million acres. They are not simply a swamp. They are one of the most layered ecological and archaeological records on the North American continent. Beneath that black water sits peat, compressed organic matter built up over thousands of years. And inside that peat, preserved at depths that most survey teams have barely reached, are fragments of what came before. Tools, bone, evidence of human presence that stretches back further than most textbooks are comfortable stating clearly. But that is not the part the research teams released to the public first. What they released first was the python footage, the population data, the mammal collapse numbers, because those numbers are extraordinary enough on their own. In core Everglades habitat zones, marsh rabbit populations have dropped by 99%, raccoons by 98%, white-tailed deer by 94%. These are not estimates. These are figures pulled from peer-reviewed field studies conducted by the United States Geological Survey over more than a decade of systematic tracking. 99%. An ecosystem does not just recover from that. It reorganizes into something different, something quieter, something that no longer resembles what it was before the disruption arrived. And here is the question the drone footage raises. The one no field researcher has been willing to answer on camera. This is not the first time a living world has gone silent in a short period of time. Ancient civilizations built entire belief systems around that exact observation. They recorded it, they warned about it, and what they left behind in clay, in stone, in texts buried for centuries, describes an aftermath that looks exactly like what those cameras are capturing right now. Long before Florida had a name, the water was already there. Not the managed, measured water of modern conservation maps. Wild water, rising and falling on its own terms, swallowing coastlines and giving them back decades later, feeding root systems so deep that trees standing today are drinking from soil layers that formed when human civilization was still learning to write. The Everglades do not behave like other places. Geologists and hydrologists have documented the way the landscape holds time differently here. The peat beneath the water's surface accumulates at a rate of roughly 1 millimeter per year under natural conditions. That means a peat column 12 feet deep is holding roughly 3,600 years of biological record, intact, layered. Every drought, every flood season, every major ecological disruption, written in compressed organic material that modern science can now read with a precision ancient observers could only describe through story. And the stories they left are not small. Job, one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew canon, many biblical scholars date its literary composition earlier than the Pentateuch, contains a passage in chapter 38 that does not read like theology. It reads like a direct challenge. The voice speaking from the storm asks a question that cuts through every century between that moment and this one. Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? The honest answer in every generation has been the same. We were not there. Humanity arrives after the structure is already in place, after the water cycles are running, after the food chains are established, after the peat begins accumulating. Humans walk into a world already built and spend most of their history assuming they understand it. The Everglades are one of the places where that assumption breaks down in plain sight.
And it's complete silence. And I used to go there when I was in my 20s, and you could hear birds, you could hear everything else. They've eaten everything. Wow. There's nothing left. And so the problem is there's nothing left to eat, and so the Miccosukee tribe is worried they're going to start coming north. And that's when you get into population centers down in Belgrade.
Researchers from the University of Florida and independent archaeological teams have documented pre-Columbian occupation sites beneath current water levels in the greater Everglades Basin. These are not fringe claims. They appear in peer-reviewed journals and in reports held by the Florida Division of Historical Resources. Cultures lived here, adapted here, and in some cases vanished here, long before European contact, long before modern drainage systems altered the water table, long before anyone thought to send a drone over the sawgrass with a camera. What the drone is catching now is an aftermath.
The Burmese pythons are here, the numbers that are here are unknown, but it's certainly in the thousands. They are detrimental to our environment. They feed on a lot of our native species, so as many as can be removed is what the state is looking to do.
The researchers know it. The population numbers confirm it. But the footage keeps raising a question that ecological data alone cannot answer. Why does this specific pattern, a living world going silent after an outside force moves through it, appear in the oldest written records on Earth? The answer is buried, literally, and the peat is only one place it was stored. In 1872, a man named George Smith was working through the clay tablet collection at the British Museum in London when he found something that stopped him mid-translation. He was cataloging fragments from the ancient Assyrian Royal Library of Nineveh, tablets excavated from the ruins of the palace of Ashurbanipal, dating to the 7th century before the Common Era. And on a tablet now registered in the British Museum's collection under the reference K3375, he read a flood account, a survivor warned by a deity, a vessel built to carry living creatures, waters that covered the land, a bird sent out to find dry ground. He reportedly left the room, and some accounts from colleagues present that day describe him as visibly shaken. What George Smith had found was the flood tablet, the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Babylonian flood narrative written centuries before the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible were copied, and describing the same essential sequence of events found in Genesis chapters 6 through 8. This is not a theological argument. This is a documented artifact sitting in a museum that millions of people walk past every year. The Epic of Gilgamesh flood account and the Genesis flood narrative share specific structural details that comparative scholars have analyzed at length. A chosen survivor, divine warning before the event, a massive vessel, the preservation of living creatures, the sending of birds to test for land, and a covenant afterward. Andrew George, professor of Babylonology at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, published the most authoritative modern translation of the Gilgamesh tablets, and his analysis makes clear that these literary traditions share ancient roots that predate either text in its current written form. Then there is the Sumerian King List, a tablet held across several museum collections, including the Ashmolean in Oxford, which describes a flood so comprehensive that it divides all of recorded human kingship into two categories: before the flood and after it. The United States Geological Survey's multi-year study on Burmese python impact in the Everglades, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, and updated through subsequent field research, documents mammal population collapses consistent across species with no parallel event in recorded modern ecological history for that region. Two bodies of evidence, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles.
There have been 743 invasive pythons removed since the 2020 challenge. Now, the exact number of pythons loose in Florida isn't known, but hunters are ready to help Florida's native wildlife fend off an animal they were never supposed to compete with.
Both describing the same shape of event. Something moves through a living world, and what it leaves behind is an aftermath so complete that the landscape can no longer recognize itself. The peat bogs beneath the Everglades water are still being sampled, and what the most recent core extractions contain has not been fully published. The python does not hunt the way most people imagine. It does not chase. It does not pursue. It positions itself along the paths that other animals have used for generations: game trails, water edges, the narrow corridors between sawgrass stands where deer and rabbits move because they have always moved there. And it waits, still as dead wood, invisible in daylight, patient in a way that has no emotional content, no strategy, no plan, just biological stillness that the surrounding ecosystem has no evolutionary history to recognize. The mammals of the Everglades never developed a fear response to a python. There was no python in their world until approximately the 1980s and 1990s, when escaped and released pets from the exotic animal trade established a breeding population in southern Florida. The prey animals had no warning system for this specific predator, no alarm call, no instinctive freeze or flight that matched the threat profile. And the collapse that followed was not gradual. A 2012 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Michael Dorcas and a team of wildlife biologists compared pre-invasion and post-invasion mammal counts along a 160-kilometer road transect in Everglades National Park. Marsh rabbit, down 99%. Raccoon, down 98.9%. Opossum, down 98.7%. White-tailed deer, down 94.1%. Bobcat, down 87.5%. Read those numbers again. Not declining, not struggling, gone. The landscape restructured around an absence. A living world does not produce that kind of silence through competition or drought or disease. That silence is the footprint of something the ecosystem had no framework to prepare for, something that arrived from outside the system entirely. In Genesis chapter 6, the text describes the earth immediately before the flood using two Hebrew words, corrupt and filled with violence. The Hebrew word translated as corrupt, shacheth.
Burmese pythons are one of the state's most fearsome invasive species.
And while they maintained a presence in the Everglades for more than 25 years, a new study reveals they're traveling north. Yay.
Carries a specific meaning in the original text. It describes something that has been destroyed from within, functionally ruined, unable to continue in its existing form. Modern English translations flatten that word into a moral category. But in its original usage, shacheth describes a structural condition, a world that cannot sustain itself any further. The Everglades post-invasion carry that same structural description, not corrupted by intention, not violent in any moral sense, but functionally changed in a way that cannot be reversed by simply removing the predator. The prey populations collapsed so completely in certain zones that even with python removal efforts underway, the mammals have not returned. The trails are still empty. The water edges are still quiet. A landscape can lose its memory of what it was supposed to hold. And here is the detail that the research teams keep circling back to without fully addressing in print. Beneath the zones of maximum ecological silence, the peat cores are showing something preserved in the deeper layers that has not yet been explained. Every ancient civilization that built something lasting built it near water. The Sumerians built Ur on the floodplain of the Euphrates. Egypt built its civilization on the Nile's annual inundation. The Indus Valley cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were constructed on the banks of a river system, so vast it fed millions. The Maya built ceremonial centers near cenotes, natural water sinkholes they believed connected the living world to the world beneath. Water meant life. Water meant fertility and harvest and trade. And in every one of those civilizations, without contact with each other, across thousands of miles of ocean and desert, water also meant judgment.
Population here in Florida. Governor DeSantis spoke in Stewart today about some new actions the state plans to take to control the growth of those pythons in the Everglades. Treasure Coast.
The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a flood sent because humanity had become too loud, too chaotic for the gods to bear. The Sumerian flood narrative preserved in the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest written texts on Earth, describes a flood decreed by divine assembly. Genesis describes a flood as the response to a world that had filled itself beyond the point of correction. The Book of Enoch, texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947, confirming its antiquity beyond serious scholarly dispute, frames the flood as the direct consequence of forbidden knowledge introduced into the human world by beings who crossed a boundary they were not permitted to cross. These are not the same story. The details differ, the theology differs, but the structure is identical across every tradition. A world reaches a point of irreversible imbalance. Water resets the conditions, and something is preserved to continue. The Everglades peat record is, in its own way, an archive of exactly that cycle. Core samples taken from sites within the Everglades basin have documented evidence of multiple dramatic hydrological events over the past 4,000 years, periods where water levels rose sharply, submerged large portions of the landscape, and then receded. Each event is readable in the peat stratigraphy. Each one left a layer. And inside those layers, archaeologists and paleoecologists have found preserved organic material, bone fragments, worked wood, plant species assemblages that tell a story of human and animal presence that predates everything currently in the textbooks about this region. Before you go any further, if this footage and what it points to is something you want to keep following.
And they're an elusive snake. They burrow themselves under the grass, under grass mats. They hide. They can reproduce massively with, dozens and dozens of eggs. Sometimes up to 80 plus eggs can be in a single clutch of snakes that can weigh up to 200 plus pounds, So the point.
This is the moment to stay close to this channel. What is coming in the next chapters is not something most documentary platforms are willing to put together in one place. Because the deeper question is not what the python left behind. It is what the water was already holding long before the python arrived. And what was found in those peat cores, preserved, intact, and still being analyzed, was not supposed to be there. The Book of Enoch was not lost by accident. It was read by the earliest Christian communities. Church fathers Origen and Tertullian referenced it directly. The writer of the New Testament letter of Jude quotes it by name, Jude chapter 1, verse 14, citing Enoch as a prophet and lifting language directly from the text. For the first several centuries of the Common Era, the Book of Enoch circulated among Jewish and Christian communities as a document with serious theological weight. Then it disappeared from Western canon, completely, for over 1,000 years. Not debated out, not voted out at a single council. It simply stopped being copied, stopped being included, stopped being mentioned, until the 18th century, when the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia carrying 3 complete manuscripts. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had never removed it. They had been reading it continuously for over 1,500 years, treating it as fully canonical scripture, sitting alongside Genesis and Psalms and the Gospels without interruption. Then in 1947, Bedouin shepherds found clay jars in caves at Qumran, near the Dead Sea. Inside those jars were scrolls. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls recovered from multiple Qumran caves, scholars identified fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, the oldest manuscript evidence for the text ever found. These were not copies of a marginal document. They were among the most frequently represented texts in the entire Qumran library. More copies of Enoch were found at Qumran than copies of most books now considered standard Old Testament canon. The text had not been fabricated in Ethiopia. It was ancient. It was circulating in the Jewish world at the time of the Second Temple, and its contents describe events that the final editors of the Hebrew Bible chose not to include in the version that reached the modern world. What Enoch describes in specific sequential detail is the arrival of beings called the Watchers, angels in the text's framing who descended to earth, took human women as wives, and produced offspring the text calls Nephilim, giants, and with them came knowledge that the human world was not prepared to receive, metalworking for weapons, the cutting of roots used for sorcery, the reading of celestial signs for manipulation rather than wisdom. The earth, the text says, filled with blood and injustice because of what was introduced into it from outside. And the response in Enoch's account was water, comprehensive, total, resetting water. The parallel is not a metaphor.
Have our native wildlife being wiped out, but it's not like you're just going to go out there and you're tripping over pythons. You know, it's not the case. I searched very, very hard to find that.
There was an estimate of 500,000 pythons.
The Everglades researchers are looking at drone footage. The ancient scribes were looking at a world they could no longer recognize. Both are describing the aftermath of the same shape of event. In the 40th chapter of the book of Enoch, 4 presences stand at the corners of existence, watching, recording, interceding. The text describes them facing the 4 directions, holding the account of what happens on earth. That image of witnesses positioned at the edges, watching everything, recording what humanity cannot see about itself, runs through the oldest sacred literature on earth like a single unbroken thread. Job chapter 38 does not open gently. The voice speaking from the storm does not ask Job how he is feeling or what he thinks went wrong. It opens with a direct demand. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Then it proceeds line by line through the architecture of creation, the foundations of the earth, the storehouses of snow, the gates of death, the binding of the Pleiades. Every question is structured the same way. Where were you? Can you? Do you know? The answer 40 times over is no. Job, who had been arguing his case against heaven with genuine courage and real grievance, goes completely quiet, not because he is defeated, because he has been shown the scale of what he was standing inside of without knowing it. That is the intellectual weight the Everglades footage carries when it is placed inside this frame. The researchers who designed the survey transects, who built the population models, who flew the drones, they are skilled, credentialed professionals working with the best tools their generation has produced. And they are watching a collapse they did not anticipate at this scale, in this time frame, with this level of completeness. The Burmese python was documented as a threat. The models projected serious impact, but the actual numbers when the field data came back exceeded the worst projections. The ecosystem knew something the models did not, and it could not communicate that knowledge in a language the researchers were listening for. This is the specific place where the Book of Enoch's framing of the Watchers becomes more than religious literature. The Watchers in the text are not evil in their origin. They are beings of knowledge and perception who cross a boundary they were warned not to cross. And the consequence is not punishment in a simple moral sense. The consequence is systemic. The world changes around the crossing of that boundary in ways that cannot be reversed by simply removing the cause. A python removed from the Everglades does not return the marsh rabbits. A boundary crossed in the ancient world, according to Enoch, does not undo itself when the immediate cause is addressed. What remains is the aftermath, recorded in peat, recorded in clay, recorded in the specific silence of a landscape that is still reorganizing itself around an absence it does not have a name for. This is the part that is hardest to sit with. The Burmese python did not walk into the Everglades. It was carried there, in bags and boxes, on planes and in cars, by people who wanted an exotic animal and did not think past the first year of ownership. When the snake grew too large, too expensive, too dangerous to manage, it was released into the water, into the grass, into an ecosystem that had spent thousands of years building a balance it took human hands less than 2 decades to unravel. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that tens of thousands of Burmese pythons now live in southern Florida. The exact number cannot be confirmed.
They're eating everything, right? They're eating all of the raccoons, the opossums, they're even eating alligators and things like that, and they're outcompeting native species in Florida. Because Florida is such a rich environment with so many animals, species like caiman, knifefish, iguanas are just prolific there, and these are all invasive species, and the Burmese python is the biggest threat among all of them.
Because the animal is nearly impossible to track through conventional survey methods. They move at night. They rest submerged. Their coloring matches the substrate of the Everglades floor with a precision that makes thermal imaging only partially effective. Researchers have turned to radiotelemetry implants in captured animals, using so-called scout snakes to locate breeding aggregations, a method that works, but scales slowly against a population of that size. Humanity introduced the problem. Humanity is now engineering its way around the consequences of its own choice. Genesis chapter 6 does not describe the pre-flood world as evil in the way modern readers often assume. It describes it as filled. The Hebrew word used is malah, filled with violence, filled with corruption, filled past the point where the existing structure could hold what had been put inside it. A world that had exceeded its own carrying capacity for what human and non-human forces had introduced into it. That is not a distant theological concept. That is a precise description of what ecologists call a system in overshoot. A system where inputs have exceeded the capacity of the structure to regulate them, where the feedback mechanisms that would normally correct the imbalance have been overwhelmed. The Everglades are in overshoot. The ancient world, according to every major flood tradition from Mesopotamia to the Hebrew Bible, was in overshoot. The water, in both cases, is not the cause. The water is the record. The water is what remains when the system can no longer hold its own weight. And here is what makes this documentary footage genuinely disturbing. Not the snake, not the empty trails, not the silence over the water. What is disturbing is the recognition. The feeling that this has a shape, that this shape has been described before, that the people who described it were not writing fiction. They were writing a warning. Stand at the edge of the Everglades at first light, and the water is absolutely still. Black surface, sky reflected back perfectly, sawgrass running to the horizon in every direction, no sound from the tree line, no movement in the shallows, just water holding the image of a sky that does not know what is underneath it. Job chapter 38 ends with a question that has never been answered by any generation that received it. The voice from the storm asks, "Have you perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare, if you know all of this." No one has declared it, not the researchers, not the theologians, not the archaeologists pulling core samples from peat that is older than any written language currently being studied, not the drone operators watching a landscape go silent in real time. No one has the full picture. No one standing in any century has been able to answer the question completely. And that is the most disturbing thing the Florida footage reveals. Not the python, not the population collapse, not even the preserved material in the deeper peat layers waiting to be fully analyzed and published. The most disturbing thing is the humility the footage demands. Humanity has satellites that can read a newspaper from orbit. It has instruments sensitive enough to detect gravitational waves produced by collisions between black holes a billion light years away. It mapped the human genome. It landed machines on Mars. And it could not prevent tens of thousands of large constrictors from taking over one of its most protected ecosystems over the course of roughly 20 years. The ancient texts did not say humanity was worthless, Job is not a story about crushing a man to make him small. Job is a story about showing a man the actual scale of what he is standing inside, so that his wisdom can be proportional to reality rather than to his own assumptions. The Everglades footage is doing the same thing. It is showing a generation that believed it had mastered the natural world exactly what mastery looks like when it meets something it did not account for. The water remembers. The peat holds the record. And the question the footage keeps asking is whether this generation is willing to hear what the oldest archives on Earth have already answered. The drone footage will keep coming. Research teams are still active in the Everglades. New survey transects are being run. New peat core extractions are being processed in laboratories. The python removal programs are ongoing. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has logged tens of thousands of removal hours, and the numbers of pythons caught keep climbing without a clear ceiling in sight. And beneath all of that documented, measurable, peer-reviewed work, the deeper questions remain exactly where they have always been. The British Museum's flood tablet is still in London. The Dead Sea Scrolls are still being translated, studied, and debated by scholars and institutions across the world. The Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library has made high-resolution scans of thousands of fragments publicly accessible, and new readings continue to emerge from material that has been physically present since 1947. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is still reading the Book of Enoch in its complete form, as it has done without interruption for 15 centuries. The Book of Job still closes without a neat resolution. God restores Job, but never explains the storm. The questions asked from that storm are never directly answered. These are not closed files. They are open records, and the pattern they describe, a world reaching a point of systemic imbalance, water as both judge and archive, the aftermath as teacher, does not appear to be finished instructing anyone. What the Florida footage adds to that record is not new theology. It is not new archaeology. It is contemporary documentation of a pattern so old that the civilizations who first described it in writing were themselves looking back at something older than their own memory could reach. The water in the Everglades is still black. The peat is still layered. The silence over the sawgrass at first light is still complete. And somewhere in the deeper core, samples not yet published, in the Aramaic fragments not yet fully translated, in the survey zones not yet fully surveyed, the archive is still open. This channel exists because these questions deserve to be brought together in one place. The hidden roots of sacred history, the deeper record of the ancient world, the things that get buried not because they are false, but because they are too large for a comfortable conversation. If that is the kind of documentary work you want to keep following, biblical archaeology, the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim, the flood traditions, the ancient texts that mainstream platforms pass over, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week, this channel goes further into what has been preserved for the people willing to look. The archive is still open. The next document is already waiting.